Hello, hello, welcome everyone. Um, Let me change this where I can see a few more people. It's great to see some familiar faces. I think several of the people who I've never met before, but just thanks. I'm excited to be sharing with you this information. And before I get started, I wanted to explain that a little bit of the reasoning behind why I'm going to give up my signs to the interpreter and just use my voice. Just because you're students, and this is a good opportunity for you to kind of learn the kind of the logic and the process of making that kind of decision, because this is almost completely a hearing audience. I've decided I'm going to speak to the group and then use the interpreter. If it was a deaf audience, I would turn off my voice and I would just sign. As a hard of hearing person, I tend to sign and talk at the same time. That's very common in terms of just conversations and hanging out, chatting, and catching up with friends and different things like that. But when you're going to be presenting something in two languages, um, it's it's very difficult to do that over an extended period of time. And so both languages, the quality start really dropping. And so that's why I decided to do it this way. We're going to record it, have the interpreter, and post it up on Facebook, where we'll really, I hope, will be seen by a much broader deaf audience in terms of what we're doing. Okay. Okay, I want to start by introducing myself. And again, I would normally not talk about my hearing deaf gain or hard of hearing or anything like that. It's just people are people. We each have our own preference of communication modalities and different things like that. I am hard of hearing. I'm deaf in one ear and hard of hearing in the other, but with a hearing aid and with speakers and just depending on the noise in the environment, I mostly live in a hearing world and interact with being able to speak and understand, doing a little bit of lip reading and different things like that. It really started about 15, 20 years ago, my deaf gain, and just, continues to go, which, to be honest with you, I really love being hard of hearing. This is a very loud world that we live in. It's just so nice to be able to kind of mute, the world around you and stuff like that. But I've been involved in deaf world for over 35 years. Um, oh, I was going to stop signing at this point, so I'd forgotten that because I'm so used to it. So I'm going to hand over those signs. Okay. Um, and so I didn't know. I had the mumps when I was young and had a little bit of hearing loss from that. My sister and I both did. But we became very close friends with a deaf couple and just became, hanging out together and just all the time hiking and camping and traveling and all like that. So that's how we really first got involved in deaf world. I didn't know that I would later start losing my hearing. Um, and we adopted 6 children, by the way, actually 5 of them officially, and one of them who's been part of our family for about 15 years unofficially. And there's 2 of them right there. And Anna, my daughter, is deaf, and she's very deaf, never used her voice, very ASL. Went to the residential school for middle school and mainstream for high school. We adopted her when she was 8 from Ecuador. And then Robert was one of our Deaf Teen Quest students. So I've known him since he was about in 10th grade, and is just a precious part of the family. And my cup where it has all my grandkids on it, his 2 kids are on that cup as well. And I think some of you may have met Robert from the area. He just moved back to Louisville. And so my daughter, when she was 14 years old, we were Christians. We go to church, and we were wanting her to be involved in the youth program, because the youth program is a great socialization place. It's a place where you can kind of grow up and interact and have good role models and all. And it was just impossible. So we looked around, and there was nothing in the country, even in the 2 major youth ministry programs, So we founded Deaf Teen Quest in 2000, and then I directed that for 19 years. And as part of raising up, part of what I do, you can see my little name here, is that I coach, leadership coach, and I raise up young leaders and help them succeed. So we have a deaf national director of Deaf Teen Quest for the last 2 or 3 years, who's doing a great job. And so my focus has shifted into the church in terms of developing deaf church. And I'm an Anglican priest. And in our tradition, if you're not familiar with priests and whatever, and the Catholic priests can't get married, but Anglican priests can get married. And so Kathy and I have been married for 42 years, an amazing person, amazing woman. I've written 2 books on deaf ministry. One this presentation is based on. It's called Deaf Diaspora, the 3rd wave of deaf ministry. And we're actually now fully in the 4th wave of deaf ministry. So that really brings you up to 2020, really, in terms of the 1st wave, 2nd wave, 3rd wave. And it has to do with just this tremendous and rapid change in deaf world that occurred, mostly due to mainstreaming and mainstream education. Second book, I brought together a group of folks who were, they were all deaf, 12 folks who were in ministry with deaf youth and young adults. So the benefit of working with teenagers and the benefit of working with young adults is I just have this up close look at what's happening today, what's happening in today's world, and understanding the changes and the rapid changes. I already mentioned REAL, Leadership Resources, and then my 2 deaf children, Robert and Anna. What I'm going to do in this presentation is divide it into 3 quick parts. And the first part will be the longest, and the last part as well. And the first part is all the rapid changes that happened. I mean, it was just dizzying how quickly deaf world went from being in one place with one language and one strong, history and large schools and all, and how rapidly that changed into this scattered population, which is what the word diaspora means. Dia means scattered, and spora means seeds. And so it's a scattering of the seeds, and which I'll talk a lot more in depth. The second section is about the adjustment, about adapting to being scattered. And I looked at 4 people group who had gone through diaspora, kind of studied what worked on that, and then said, here's what we need to do in this day and age. And so there were positive things and there were negative things. But basically, and you may hear me say this again, before 1980, 85, 85% of the deaf went to the residential schools, or 80%, and 20% were mainstreamed. Right now, it's completely shifted, except it's closer to 85% who are mainstreamed, and only about 15 to 20% who are at the residential schools. And the residential schools were essential for the preservation of the deaf culture and of ASL and traditions and customs and all, and a very, very important thing. So you can imagine that this was a very difficult transition to go from, excuse me, from something that had been very stable to something that was totally in disarray and in change. Well, and from 2010, I mean, these are all just rough estimates, until the present, we've really found some equilibrium. And so the last part will be on just how the deaf community thrives now in terms of that transition. I have to mute my mic here for the most famous diaspora is of the the Jewish people, and that's really where the word came from. And it's in historic Israel, they had divided into two countries. You had the northern country of Israel, and then you had the southern country of Judah. This is back however many years ago. Actually, it was like 700 BC, so almost 3,000 years ago when this was happening. And so the northern tribes, they got conquered by Assyria, and they were just scattered and never recovered. The southern tribes, they were conquered about 200 years later by Babylon, and which is, I think, Iran, current day Iran would have been in that era. But they were kind of kept intact and actually came back. And that's when they established Israel in 48, 49, whatever, 48, I believe. They chose the name Israel for that land and for that country. And so it's a really very different experience of scattering that occurred as a result of that diaspora. But that's where that word really originated. And it's almost always not under your own will. It's always not like, hey, let's all just move all over the world. It's usually because somebody has come in and has oppressed you and has controlled you and has marginalized you, and you flee, you know. And it comes from a pandemic, it comes from a famine, it comes from war, it comes from something like that. Well, for the deaf community, it came from what was intended to be very good things, and arguably have been mostly good, which was basically the mainstream. But here's what's really interesting. Let's go back and let's look at this group of deaf who were born between 1964 and 1969. Who are known as part of the rubella measles epidemic. The rubella babies was a kind of common name that was not only the deaf, but there were a number of other groups that kind of came out of that with blind and other kinds of challenges and differences. But that group was about 3 to 4 times the size of any other group of deaf who were born at that time. And just like any other baby boomers, like my age group, they have a huge impact on what happens. And so what came out of that were some laws that were put together in the 70s that were basically the ADA and the Individuals with Disability Act, the Public Law 94-142. Now, these are all happening in the 70s. And remember, these children were born almost in 70, 64 to 69, this bulge of deaf kids that came through. And so you can see that it's really the parents of these kids who have been advocating for them to say, hey, we need better schools, we need more access, we need these different rights of their children who came through at that point. Interestingly, the most significant thing in deaf history of this last 100 years was called the Deaf President Now movement, and you should all be familiar with that if you haven't come with that. But if you look at the age of that group who protested, and it was actually fabulous to watch. I was teaching in Georgia at that time. And I was teaching something about community organization and about protests and different things like that. And this all happened during that same time. And so I started showing it to my classes and tracking how those leaders were leading in this protest. And it was textbook. I mean, it was amazing. It was the best, well-organized kind of protest group that probably is as good as anything I've ever seen in terms of the way they did that. Well, that group of folks, if you think about and do your math, were between 19 and 24 years old. And so what you had the power of the numbers. You had the power of the baby boomers from the rubella measles, who now were college students. And they had opportunities, they had laws, they had rights, they had the ADA. I remember, when we would march ADA, and just how exciting that was. During that Deaf President Now, one of the leaders, there were 4 leaders that are called the famous leaders of this, and one of them was Greg Hilbach, I think Greg's right. Yes, Greg Hillbach. And they're on TV, on the news, and talking about these different things. And it was just fabulous. And he made this statement that before deaf president now, deaf people lived in a climate of oppression where they were made to believe their employment opportunities were limited. But after DPM, deaf president now, that mindset changed immediately. And that mindset was that deaf person could do anything. And so just like my generation with Woodstock and with the Vietnam protests and the civil rights movement and all the different things and the impact that the hearing boomers, the deaf boomers had the same kind of impact and just really were just very, very good. The four leaders, I believe, I can't verify this, but I believe the four leaders were all deaf of deaf. They had deaf parents, and so they grew up in a language-rich environment, and were all residential school students in terms of that protest. So then you can go on in terms of the other things that were happening as all this was happening was this just massive shift from residential schools to mainstreaming that was happening. With the mainstreaming, instead of being, on the football team and, cheerleaders and student government and in the residential school, there's this huge scattering and proliferation where you had, like my daughter, when she went to high school, was the only deaf student in a school of 2,000 hearing people. And so there were just fewer opportunities to develop a lot of those kind of leadership skills. And so during that transition, it was, there was lots of good and lots of challenges, and there's still a lot of challenges. And so that mainstreaming was really what caused the diaspora. Okay, good, bad, indifferent. It's still that was a huge change, but it wasn't the only change that was happening. Rapidly, technology was going on. When I was first involved in the deaf world, they used to actually use the old teletypewriter machines. And one of my friends had one in their garage, and they had this big roll of paper. And these are the old, I don't know exactly what the technology was in terms of getting, messages from ships out at sea or something. And then that became down to this small little machine that you put your telephone on and you would type and all. But that started revolutionizing things from the whole culture in terms of the fact that it used to be very common if you were deaf to leave your front door unlocked so that if any of your deaf friends came over, they could come in and get your attention. And so, things began changing to where now people, were starting to, text and whatever, but you can imagine all the changes that happen now and how different it is. Well, that had a huge effect on the deaf community. And finally, instead of the deaf always following behind hearing people in terms of information, in terms of trends or whatever, the deaf were actually ahead of the hearing people because they were getting technology before the hearing people were getting technology. We were doing video calls 5-6 years before hearing people were doing video calls, and it was just the technologies made a tremendous thing. Now, there's a positive part of it and a negative part of it in the deaf community, because the technology does bring people together, but it also separates people because my best friend lives in California, or my best friend, somebody I met online who lives in France, and so instead of the attraction to go to the deaf club, the attraction to go to deaf events really decreased. And so a lot of the older deaf were saying, well, where are all the young people? And so that became sort of again a positive thing and a challenge. This is all moving into the transition. The workplace dramatically changed. There used to be that the post office might have 30 or 40 deaf folks who were working there at the post office. Printing companies, and in an earlier day, it was like even sewing machine manufacturers or factories. And so you would have not only the residential school, but then you'd have this whole block of folks who were working in these other industries. So during this transition time, they started changing and automating the post office, and more deaf folks were out of jobs, and at that point, FedEx and UPS and these kinds of groups had not grown up, who now are where a lot of deaf folks work at Amazon or at one of these kind of places. But it was just this dramatic change in technology and the workplace. And interestingly, it used to be very common to have vocational training in deaf schools. Well, as we sort of went through this idea of no, well, I mean, it's a good phrase, but no child left behind, they were closing down all these vocational opportunities and training in high school. And so this unemployment is just astronomical in the deaf world. Now it's 75% is the number I've heard of deaf folks altogether who are unemployed. And then 50% of college graduates are unemployed in deaf world. And so the workplace has really changed dramatically. And again, weren't the places of the center of deafness and deaf community and ASL and storytelling and all the different things. So it was a ton of changes. And one more thing is religion really changed in the fact that it used to be the schools for the deaf would have, the Jewish temple and the Catholic Church and the Baptist Church and the other folks that they'd actually come in and they were kids were a part of things. And whether a lot of folks don't realize this, but deaf education began in the church, the Catholic Church, and the priests and the monks for 250 years. That religion was part of ASL, part of learning life skills, part of socialization and having lots of different relationships. When it came to the United States, it was the Episcopal Church primarily, and then the Lutheran Church and some others. But in 1900, there were like 8 ordained Episcopal priests. And if you probably don't know that much about it, but the expectation, the first deaf man who was ordained as a priest, he's deaf, was fluent in 6 languages. He taught at Gallaudet. He did at American University. He was a remarkable guy. And so the threshold at that point was very high, but the deaf education, because of the language and the communication, was very, very strong, for particularly that college bound folks. And so you had a lot of vocational, you had a real community, but you also had this very, very smart kind of well-educated deaf community there. So as all of that began changing just rapidly, as those kids, when they went to the schools for the deaf, they weren't staying on the weekends, so they didn't have a Sunday or a Saturday off to do some of this thing. This became just a dramatic drop in involvement. And part of what religion does is it gives you a sense of self, a sense of place in the universe, a sense of purpose and doing, service projects and doing visiting nursing homes or whatever. And so that's was something that the deaf community, which had been very much a part of their history, had been just completely erased out. And so again, there's this sort of this disconnect relationally and the struggle with with identity and sense of self and whatever, particularly during this time. And I do want to maintain, and this is the fact that ASL during the darkest days of oralism really survived, primarily through the church, because that was the place that the oralists would just sort of stay back and let them, they were doing their own thing and whatever. But it really was something that kept, during those days, that was the place that you could sign. That was the place that no one would, that you had role models and you were communicating. The dorm in a residential setting is also to get some credit with that, because that was also a place where all the people who were the oralists, for the most part, if you were lucky and didn't have a dorm parent who was, they weren't around, and so that did it some. But the church was really an essential part of that maintaining of deaf culture and of American Sign Language. Okay, so what I want to do right now is stop sharing and Hey, Stephen, how are you? Good to see you. Um, so, are there any questions, Eliza, that you have that I could pause for a moment?
If anyone has any questions, just write it in the chat. Or, yeah, I think that's the best method.
Okay, well, let's pause. You keep thinking about it. We'll have a second time that you can ask some questions at the end, okay? And okay, so as I was looking at and watching everything that was changing between 1980, I guess 1984, when I first became involved in deaf community, and just the amazing, dizzying changes that occurred between 1984 and say 2004, in that 20 years. Um, and so I began studying these four different groups, and I mentioned the northern tribes of Israel. And what happened is something that anybody who's in diaspora has to develop an ability to have balance between enculturation, which is the passing on of your language and your culture, and acculturation, which is adapting to a majority culture. Okay, so let's think about this. Enculturation is, the ancient, creeds and songs and storylines. My mother had a very strong Irish background, and all these little stories and sayings and different things. That's enculturation, passing on, that I pass on to my children. Acculturation is adapting to the culture you're living in, and we are living in this country, and so we adapt to this country's language and laws and customs and traditions, and so the balance between those two is the key for how you survive diaspora. There's not much more important than those two words and understanding how a people group such as the deaf were scattered by mainstreaming, how they're able to survive and then eventually thrive has to do with this balance of acculturation and enculturation. So as I studied these four groups, and I give you four different examples of this, the northern tribes of Israel, they, as I mentioned, were conquered by Assyria in about 730 something BC. And they were scattered out, and they were intermarried into, and they were kept from, they were hugely acculturated into the majority cultures, and they became virtually unfindable. It's almost like in the United States, there was a book that was written about the Native American diaspora, and it says only the names remain, meaning we have all these roads that are named after different Native American tribes and Native American people, but the people have just been, sort of just a genocide, and have been, and we'll talk about them in terms of how that response was here. So in the northern tribes, they were just only the names remained, and you see hints of it, but basically those were lost over time. The southern two tribes of Judah were taken to Babylon, and they were kept together. They kind of kept meeting, and they kept their traditions, and they didn't have the temple in Jerusalem, but they stayed, together. And then after 70 years, they came back to southern Israel now, Jerusalem and that area, and they kind of reestablished, and they built back the traditions and all, and they have passed down those traditions in to today. And Shema and the different things that have gone down, the worship, the Torah, and all the different things that have been passed down for thousands of years, with these two tribes in hundreds of different countries. Okay, because they also were scattered, but they were able to maintain their identity, whether they were in Germany or whether they're in France or whether they're in Russia or wherever they live, that they were able to maintain that. So they are a good example of a people group who have found the right balance between learning the language and the customs of the majority population, but maintaining the traditions and the language, the religion, the language of previous generations. The African American community, the same thing. There's this terrible diaspora. They came from chattel slavery and from the horrible things that occurred in this diaspora, and they have been able to maintain a sense of identity and African American and a sense of traditions and passing things on while learning and adjusting and adapting to the customs and the language and the traditions, of the majority culture. And both of those are just fabulous examples of that. Now, with the Native American, what has happened, because again, through no fault of their own, have had major enculturation in terms of these different tribes in these different areas where they pass down the traditions. They have the powwow, they have the dance, the language, but there's minimal acculturation into the larger the population in those settings. Again, that's a vast generalization, but when they did the Olympics in Utah back in, it's probably been 15 years ago, when they opened up the Olympics, they had these 4 different tribes who all live in Utah, who are different Native American tribes, who did their language and made some sort of an introduction. And the languages were completely different. They didn't sound alike. There didn't seem to be any similarity in these different areas. So as deaf people were facing diaspora, they had to adjust to the fact that we don't have our homelands anymore of the residential school. We don't have sort of these large socialization of the deaf club and all like we did before. We are mainstream. We're having to learn how to be the only deaf kid or of a small group of deaf kids and a large hearing. So how do you maintain your identity? How do you maintain your sense of self when being scattered like this in a diaspora? And so once again, it comes back down to enculturation and acculturation. And let me mention that the Southern tribes of Judah and the African American diaspora both have something in common in the fact that there is some belief in a God or a deity of some sort who will get us through this time of diaspora. And again, the African American church, it was just a huge part of surviving all the oppression and all the abuse, and that sense of we've got to keep hope alive, we've got to keep going. And the same thing with the Jewish community and keeping the traditions and some sort of a belief that something's going to keep us going. That's true of any religion or any group of people in the world, that when they're in the diaspora, if there's a sense of community, a sense of we're in this together, we've got something, and we have a sense of hope, then that's something that's very, very essential in surviving through a time of diaspora. So rapid changes in the last 2 decades of the 20th century, and just dramatic adjustments, lots of missteps, lots of mistakes, and trying to find the balance of enculturation and acculturation. And then what's emerged is a really wonderful thing in terms of seeing this whole new generation of deaf leadership that has a great sense of self, a great sense of deafhood, and that is and in fact, I saw that Patty Ladd was going to be speaking, and he's the one that coined that term in terms of deafhood and a sense of self, that I'm okay. I live in a hearing world, and I don't want to be above. I don't want to be below. I just want to be equal and have access, and I have a great sense, and I'm proud of who I am, and I like who I am, and I'm not a broken hearing person. I'm a deaf person, and I have a great sense of self, and so that's just been fabulous to see. Again, technology is a huge part of that because it allows us to gather. It allows us to connect. There's such a scattering of the deaf community that technology has been a great help. It's also been a great challenge in terms of how people get very addicted to technology and how they get very comfortable talking to people on technology, but they're awkward when they are in person. It's very interesting. As you know, we started Deaf Teen Quest, and a lot of what Deaf Teen Quest offered was socialization and interaction, between teenagers. So we'd go have an activity. We'd go rock climbing or high ropes or something like this. Fabulous interaction between deaf, and most of our leaders were deaf, and so it was great role models. We'd get back in the car, and the kids would I'd turn around in a little minivan, and one kid's on one phone over here texting to somebody else over here, and the other kid's on the other phone texting and to somebody else over there. And so the technology was pulling them away from this rich experience of being able to just chat and talk and be, with your friends. So there's also that negative side of it as well. Sorry, I'm getting this the wrong way. It's a culture of education. In the fact that it's very interesting, and it used to be that people really identified with their residential school. So you would say, well, what school did you go to? And you're not talking about college. You're talking about what, did you go to Iowa School for the Deaf, or did you go to, Indiana School for the Deaf? And so because of the mainstreaming with 80 to 85% of deaf students going to mainstream, but also because there's a great deal of shifting around between, you may be in mainstream school for first and second grade, and you may go to deaf school, until middle school, and then you may go to a, kind of a hybrid program, in middle school, and you may go back to deaf school, and you may go back to a magnet program. And so that there's a lot more of this identification with multiple schools instead of Kentucky School for the Deaf or the Florida School of Deaf and Blind. Gallaudet and NTID in New York are still the heart of Deaf World and ASL and Deaf Scholarship, and continues to elevate a very highly educated deaf leadership that believes they can do anything. They can work, and accomplish anything, and have a good sense of self and their identity as part of education. And so in a lot of ways, there's a couple of my deaf colleagues and I were talking, in a lot of ways, we're finally getting back to where we were before the Council of Milan and the damage that did to the deaf community. And it's taken us, whatever that is, 200 years to finally get the deaf communities back to a level that they were before that, that terrible time of oralism. So it's also a culture of the media. And what I mean by that is deaf kids are greatly influenced by hearing media. And originally it was always like they were just observers and all, but more and more the deaf young people are taken the lead in creating their own media, and DPAN, deaf performers, and I'm sorry, I can't think offhand what the DPAN is, but that they are producing. There's just great stuff being produced by the deaf community, and so, but that the influence means that whatever's happening in the larger media population is quickly getting to the deaf child and teenager, and because it's such a small, tied together community, that many times in school settings, whatever comes into one kid's life spreads through the rest of the group. And so it's much more at the kind of the mercy of the culture of the media coming around. There's a very positive part of that, because it really helps people realize, hey, I can do this. I can start a business. I can, do a blog. I can do a vlog. I can, these kinds of things. But it also is this massive influence of acculturation that's coming in, and so a lot of the traditional culture, is challenged by that in terms of the enculturation. So again, these are good things, but they have to be understood in the context of, this is something that informs me, but it doesn't necessarily form me. I need to understand who I am as a deaf individual. And it's a culture of relationship and diversity. And what I mean by that is, in the enculturation, we have this very pure understanding of the deaf culture and of ASL and of these traditions and of etiquette, what's proper, what's offensive, and those are sacred. I mean, they really are precious, and they need to be taught and they need to be passed on. But when it comes down to interacting with peers, it really is about relationship. It's about being known and knowing and expressing and understanding by any means necessary. So that means if we're, one person's been mainstream and they're very English, and the other person's, maybe mainstreamed and very, very ASL, that there's this effort to really know and be known and connect, and a much more of an acceptance of the fact that, hey, I just want to know you're somebody, that I might like or I might enjoy hanging out with. And so we have to adapt. We have to code shift. Just like I explained at the beginning, how I made the decision to just talk and let the interpreter interpret in this setting, is that the goal is for us to be humans together and to be connected. And so whatever it takes to remove communication roadblocks, and you get that. I know you've probably been watching Deaf U on Netflix, and you see, one kid speaking is very, has cochlear implant and is very oral, and the other kid's signing very ASL, and it's like, that's fine. That's your personal choice. But what I want is to connect with you, and so we're willing to adapt. And so this is something that I think is a really important part of this balance of acculturation and enculturation, is that the priority is relationship, and the acceptance is of diversity, and whoever you are, I just want a friend I can trust. I just want somebody who I can depend on. Let me see where I am in my, and then this is the final slide, and then we're going to stop here in just a few minutes. And it comes back to this whole idea of the culture of deafhood, that's also a part of this whole sense of self, and that the diaspora is real. It was this rapid change. It was this hard adjustment. But now we're moving into a time of just a vibrant, an exciting, diverse community. And at the heart of it is this sense of self, this sense of deafhood, that this is, the challenge is, how do you develop that when you're isolated? And so we come back to the fact that gathering is valuable. It is important to get together and not just, you know, have long distance internet friendships. That hanging out is important. ASL is a birthright for children with hearing loss. It's their birthright. This is an important issue because that's part of developing a sense of self, is being included in the conversation, being included in the activities that are happening. There's one other thought that I'm so as kids are deaf teenagers and children are growing up, and they're in the process of making sense out of this and learning the language. I think that the people who are around have a real responsibility. Oh, I know what I was going to say. I'm sorry. The Deafhood Foundation, which is a marvelous, strong statement of deafhood, about a year ago made this huge proclamation to the community and said basically the same thing that I'm saying here, that we need to stop separating ourselves from other deaf who are different than we are, who use a different sign language, or they are more oral, or they're more English, or whatever. We need to be unified. They in fact made the statement that they didn't really like for people to use the term hard of hearing, which is the term I use to describe myself, as I was talking earlier with that. Because that puts you in an advantage role with the hearing world that is not appropriate. And so that there needs to be a sense of the deaf community is a wide, accepting place for folks who are a part of that. And it's going to be very diverse and very accepting of that diversity, and a sense of self that allows for us to be very different, but still part of the deaf community. So it's an exciting time. And as I told the students when I was there last year or whatever, this is a great time to be learning about ASL and be learning about the deaf community. And it's an exciting time in the history of our world in terms of recovering from the Council of Milan back in the 1880s, and to have a sense of a very vibrant, well-educated, confident opportunity for deaf and hard of hearing folks. Okay. Thank you, interpreter. You're doing a great job. Let's go on for an hour here. Is there a question? Oh, thank you, Deaf. Thank you, Yari. Thank you, wherever you are. The Deaf Professional Artists Network was DPAN. If you haven't found that yet, you need to make sure you make that a priority. That's a collection of some of the greatest, most creative resources that are being developed. Eliza, have you picked out questions for me?
Yes. Okay. So first question is, for people who don't know ASL, do you have any recommendations for how we can show support and love for those we meet who may be deaf?
It's a good question, good goal in terms of being support. To me, the answer is just recognize that you're the learner, and that you will you just need to be a friend, and you need to be someone who's making the effort to connect and to interact with, and that you will learn in that process. it's, I remember my daughter just saying that, in terms of going into the hearing church and the hearing experience, she said, at first it's all, everybody's interested in wanting to learn sign and everything. And then they all just leave me alone. I mean, they just leave me and stuff. And so I think the best way to show support and love is just to be authentic and to be, dependable, and to, to just decide. And if this is, somebody you want to be a friend with and hang out with, and remember, you're the learner, and you're the visitor in the land of death.
Thank you. All right, we have another question. How did the pandemic affect the deaf community specifically, or were the hearing and deaf communities impacted in the same way?
Wow, that's a great question. I think, again, I'm not deaf, and so I'm in my kind of in between world, but I mostly with my hearing aid, I have not heard that. But from my deaf friends, what I've seen and heard is, wow, it has been so difficult, specifically with the covering of the mask and stuff, because you depend so much on the expressions and the nuances and the reading. And even for me, I mean, it really is, for me to understand someone with the mask on, it just drops a lot. And so it's just this one, actually, Rinsa Dunn is a good friend of mine. I don't know, you probably know her, and you should. She's just an amazing performer and all. And she does the Deaf News, the Daily Moth, and she's one of the folks there. And she wrote this long blog about it and just said, I just started crying. It just feels so lost, and not being able to just connect with people's visually and their faces, and and then of course you're left out of knowing what's going on. So I think it has been very, very difficult on a lot of people groups, but the deaf specifically as well. But that'd be a good question to ask Yari or Stephen, your teachers and all. Parenting a deaf daughter.
I think we. Oh, sorry. There are two questions in the chat, and I think we'll cover those, and then we'll be out of time. So I'll start with the first one. How do you think your experience parenting your deaf daughter as a deaf, hard of hearing father was different from that of a hearing parent parenting a deaf child?
Again, good question. It is different because we do have a connection, but it's and I think I have just kind of a more, I don't know, a sensitivity and kind of recognizing when things are sort of off. But my wife is hearing, she has a great relationship with our daughter, but even my experience is not her experience, and it's impossible for me to understand that feeling, because again, mine was kind of early onset age related and stuff. I was not a teenager trying to navigate being hard of hearing. I was not a child experiencing that. But I do think that it is more of, I don't know, just a little bit closer in terms of understanding that experience, not just understanding it in the head, but understanding it in my heart, as well. And last question.
Oh, here we are. Okay. So, what is your opinion on Deaf U? I have heard it's controversial in the deaf community. What have your deaf friends said about it?
Well, I've only talked to my daughter about it, and she said she hates it. She said, I thought they would have classrooms and show the language, and she and my response, and again, maybe some of this is expectation. I thought it would be maybe a little different. Some of it maybe is my age, but it was really kind of embarrassing for me in terms of like, okay, this should be on MTV, or this should be on, something else, but this shouldn't be sort of our representative of the deaf community. And so other than that, I've not talked to any of my other colleagues and all about that.
There's actually one more question in the chat that we can cover quickly. In regards to the presidential, vice presidential debates, with the limited access to live interpreters, do you feel that this is a communication barrier, or have you heard the deaf community's opinion on this?
Yeah, I think it is. It's so frustrating and such a, it's just so insensitive that it has been so limited. Now, again, tonight, if any of you are going to watch the debate, go to DPAN and they'll have it interpreted and have it, very accessible. But why should DPAN have to do that when, they could do that, the United States of America and whatever. And, it's interesting. Sometimes we think, we're so far ahead of the rest of the world. But man, when I watch international news, I see interpreters all the time, who are in place in these different countries. So it's like we need to get past, whatever is that barrier is, and it especially now in this election, if there's ever time to have 2 interpreters or 3 interpreters or whatever, this would be a good one. So I do want to say thank you again for letting me, present. I hope that was beneficial and to help you see some of kind of what's happening. And if you can think in those 3 parts, this rapid change, this adjustment, and then this thriving deaf community, that I think you have the summary of what I was wanting to accomplish tonight. And thank you to the interpreter. That was a long presentation.
Yes, thank you very much for presenting, and thank you for everyone who came. We really appreciate it. Thank you for coming out.